Did you know that despite receiving over $1 trillion in aid, Africa is still one of the poorest regions in the world? What if I told you that the very thing meant to help Africa might actually be holding it back? Welcome to Afri Facts. Today, we're diving into Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, a bold and controversial book that challenges one of the most deeply held beliefs in global development, that foreign aid is the solution to Africa's problems. Instead, Moyo argues that aid has trapped Africa in a cycle of dependency, corruption, and poverty, and she proposes there's a better way forward. If you care about Africa's future, you'll want to stick around for this. Chapter 1 sets the stage by asking the tough question: why is Africa still poor? Despite decades of aid, many African countries remain underdeveloped, and in some cases, worse off than before. Moyo explains that aid was initially seen as a lifeline, especially after independence, but over time it became a crutch. Rather than fostering growth, it fueled corruption, weakened local institutions, and created a dependency mindset. She shows how well-meaning aid often doesn't reach ordinary people. Instead, it strengthens bad governments and distorts economies. The key message? Africa's underdevelopment is not due to a lack of money or ideas. It's partly because the aid system itself is broken. This first chapter is just the beginning of Moyo's eye-opening critique. In the next chapters, she digs deeper into how aid actually harms Africa and offers alternative paths to real, sustainable development. If you want to understand why aid might be doing more harm than good, and what Africa can do instead, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Afri Facts, and stay tuned for our breakdown of Chapter 2. What if the story of aid in Africa wasn't really about charity, but about politics, power, and control? Let's uncover the history that shaped the modern aid system. Today, in Chapter 2 of Dambisa Moyo's Dead Aid, we trace the history of aid, how it began, how it grew, and why it became the backbone of development policy in Africa. Chapter 2, titled A Brief History of Aid, walks us through the origins of foreign aid after World War II. At first, aid wasn't about Africa at all. It was about Europe. The US launched the Marshall Plan, a massive aid program that helped rebuild Europe's economies devastated by the war. Since this program was seen as a success, many believed the same model could be applied to Africa. But the motives soon shifted. During the Cold War, aid became a powerful political weapon. Western countries gave money to African governments, not necessarily to promote development, but to win allies and counter the influence of the Soviet Union. This meant aid often went to leaders who were corrupt, authoritarian, or uninterested in true development, as long as they aligned with the donor country's political agenda. By the 1960s and 1970s, as African nations gained independence, aid took on a new role. It was marketed as a tool for poverty reduction and growth, but in reality, it often propped up weak states and poor policies. Loans and grants poured in, but they did not translate into lasting development. Instead, many African countries ended up with mounting debt burdens. The 1980s brought the structural adjustment era led by the IMF and World Bank. These institutions gave money on the condition that African governments adopt strict economic reforms, like cutting public spending, devaluing currencies, and liberalizing markets. While these policies were supposed to create efficiency, they often caused social hardship, rising unemployment, weaker health and education systems, and unrest among the poor. Then came the 1990s and early 2000s, when aid was repackaged again, this time under the banner of good governance, democracy, and poverty alleviation. Major campaigns like the Jubilee 2000 debt relief movement tried to reset the system by canceling some African debts. But the cycle continued. New aid kept flowing in, new promises were made, yet poverty persisted. Moyo's point is clear. Aid has constantly shifted shapes, from Cold War politics to structural reforms to modern poverty reduction campaigns. But through it all, Africa's progress has been limited. Instead of fostering independence, the aid system created long-term dependency. Chapter 2 reveals that aid has never been a neutral or purely humanitarian effort. It has always been tied to political interests, global power struggles, and donor priorities. Understanding this history is crucial to see why the current system still doesn't deliver real growth for Africa. So now we know. Aid in Africa isn't just about helping, it's also about control. In Chapter 3, Dambisa Moyo shows exactly how aid can cripple economies from within. If you're learning something new and want to keep following this journey through Dead Aid, hit the like button, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to Afri Facts for Chapter 3. Aid is not working. Imagine pouring water into a bucket with holes. No matter how much you add, it never fills. That's exactly how Dambisa Moyo describes foreign aid in Africa, a system that looks generous on the surface, but leaks away before it ever helps the people who need it most. In Chapter 2 of Dead Aid, we trace the history of foreign aid, from the Marshall Plan to Cold War politics to debt relief campaigns. Now in Chapter 3, Moyo takes us deeper, showing us exactly why aid is failing Africa today and how it creates more problems than it solves. Chapter 3 is bluntly titled, Aid is Not Working. Moyo doesn't just make this claim, she shows us how. She starts with a powerful idea. When billions of dollars flow into African countries year after year, they don't strengthen governments. They often weaken them. Why? Because leaders no longer depend on their citizens for tax revenue. Instead, they depend on foreign donors. This breaks the natural bond of accountability between governments and the people. Take a simple example. In countries where governments raise money through taxes, citizens demand better services, good roads, working hospitals, and honest leadership. But in many African nations flooded with aid, governments don't need taxpayers. They need donors. And donors aren't the ones voting, protesting, or living with the consequences. This creates what Moyo calls a broken contract between the state and the people. Worse, aid often fuels corruption. When large sums of money arrive with weak oversight, it's like opening a vault with no guards. Moyo highlights cases where aid money was siphoned into private bank accounts abroad, while citizens remained poor at home. In some countries, leaders even used aid to finance patronage networks, rewarding friends and punishing opponents, keeping themselves in power for decades. Then there's the economic distortion. Massive inflows of aid can drive up inflation, kill local industries, and discourage entrepreneurship. Imagine trying to start a small business when free goods and services keep pouring in from outside. Local markets shrink, innovation stalls, and dependency deepens. Moyo also stresses the psychological cost. Generations of Africans are raised with the belief that progress must come from outside, from donors, not from within. This dependency mindset strips people of the confidence to build sustainable solutions themselves. In short, aid is not only failing to fix Africa's problems, it's making many of them worse. Chapter 3 forces us to rethink the entire aid model. The problem isn't that Africa lacks resources, ideas, or talent. The problem is that aid creates a cycle of dependency, corruption, and economic stagnation, a cycle that has trapped Africa for decades. In Chapter 4, Moyo goes even further, showing us the specific ways aid harms Africa's long-term growth. So, if you believe Africa deserves better than a broken system, make sure to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Afri Facts for our deep dive into Chapter 4 of Dead Aid. Chapter 4, The Silent Killer of Growth. What if the very medicine prescribed to cure Africa's poverty is actually poisoning its economy? In Chapter 4 of Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo reveals how aid quietly kills the very thing Africa needs most: economic growth. So far, we've seen how aid history is rooted in politics and how it fuels dependency and corruption. Now in Chapter 4, Moyo takes us deeper into the economic side, showing how aid strangles growth, prevents markets from flourishing, and locks Africa into a cycle of poverty. This chapter is called The Silent Killer of Growth, and for good reason. Moyo argues that sustained economic growth, not endless aid, is the only true path to prosperity. But aid actually undermines this growth in several ways. First, aid fuels inflation and currency distortion. When large amounts of foreign currency flow into a country, the local currency often strengthens artificially. This makes African exports more expensive and less competitive in global markets. Imagine a farmer growing coffee in Ethiopia or cocoa in Ghana. Because aid dollars inflate the local currency, their products become pricier abroad, shrinking their chance to compete. Second, aid discourages investment and entrepreneurship. Investors crave stability, transparency, and accountability. But aid-dependent economies often lack these qualities. Instead, they're unpredictable, heavily donor-driven, and prone to sudden policy shifts. Why would a local entrepreneur risk starting a factory when aid is flooding the market with free goods? Why would a foreign investor build in Africa when governments rely more on donors than on sustainable policies? Third, aid creates boom and bust cycles. Just like resource-rich countries sometimes suffer from the resource curse, aid-rich countries face similar instability. Heavy aid inflows encourage short-term spending rather than long-term investment. Roads are built but not maintained, hospitals open but lack medicine, schools are constructed but teachers go unpaid. When donor money dries up, everything collapses. Moyo also draws attention to Africa's debt crisis. For years, aid came in the form of loans rather than grants. Countries borrowed heavily, often with little to show for it, leading to crippling debt burdens. Even debt relief campaigns didn't solve the root problem, the flow of easy money without accountability. She calls aid a silent killer because its damage isn't always obvious at first. On the surface, you see new infrastructure, government programs, and donor-funded projects. But underneath, it quietly erodes competitiveness, discourages self-reliance, and stifles real economic transformation. Her conclusion is simple yet powerful. Africa doesn't need more aid. It needs growth, fueled by trade, investment, and innovation, not dependency. Chapter 4 makes it crystal clear. Aid is not neutral. It doesn't just help a little. It actively kills Africa's chance at long-term prosperity. The silent killer isn't poverty itself. It's the system designed to fight it. In Chapter 5, Moyo flips the narrative, showing us that not only does aid fail, but Africa has other, better ways to rise. She begins to lay out real alternatives. If you believe Africa deserves solutions that actually work, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Afri Facts so you don't miss the next chapter of Dead Aid. Chapter 5, A Radical Rethink of Aid. What if I told you Africa doesn't actually need aid to grow, that the continent already has the tools to build its own future? In Chapter 5 of Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo begins to flip the script, showing us that real solutions already exist, and they don't come in the form of handouts. In the last chapter, we saw how aid silently kills economic growth. Now, in Chapter 5, Moyo shifts the focus from problems to possibilities. She argues that Africa doesn't need to depend on aid forever because there are real, sustainable alternatives that can drive development. This chapter is a turning point in the book. Up until now, Moyo has been dismantling the case for aid. But in Chapter 5, titled A Radical Rethink of Aid, she asks a bold question. What if we stopped aid completely within the next decade? She admits, this sounds drastic, but her point is that aid is not the only path. In fact, it's the weakest path. Instead, she lays out several powerful alternatives that can fuel Africa's growth. 1. Trade. Not aid. Moyo argues that trade has the power to transform Africa far more than aid ever could. She points out that African countries have enormous natural resources and agricultural potential, yet they remain marginal players in global markets. Why? Because global trade rules are unfair, with tariffs and subsidies that favor wealthy nations. If Africa could trade fairly, especially in commodities and agriculture, it would generate wealth that no aid package could match. 2. Foreign direct investment, FDI. Instead of relying on donor checks, Africa could attract private investors who bring not only money, but also skills, technology, and jobs. She highlights China as an example. Rather than sending aid, China has been investing heavily in Africa's infrastructure, mining, and energy. These investments, while not without challenges, create industries and employment in ways aid never has. 3. Accessing global capital markets. Moyo stresses that African nations should learn to borrow money the same way other countries do, through international bond markets. She points to examples of African countries that successfully issued bonds and financed development projects. This kind of borrowing, when managed responsibly, builds accountability because investors demand returns and transparency, unlike aid donors who often overlook corruption. Harnessing domestic resources, Africa already generates wealth through natural resources, remittances from its diaspora, and local entrepreneurship. Instead of depending on external aid, governments can strengthen policies to harness these sources, making economies more self-sufficient. The radical rethink here is not just about economics, it's about psychology. Moyo insists that Africa must change its mindset from dependency to self-reliance. As long as aid keeps flowing, governments have no incentive to pursue these alternatives. But once aid stops, the pressure to innovate and reform will push Africa forward. Chapter 5 is a turning point. Africa is not doomed to aid dependency. Real alternatives exist: trade, investment, capital markets, and domestic resources. What Africa needs is the courage to move away from aid and embrace self-driven growth. In Chapter 6, Moyo dives deeper into one of these alternatives, specifically the role of trade, and explains why Africa's future depends on being a competitor, not a charity case. If you're ready to see Africa rise through its own strength, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Afri Facts for the next chapter breakdown of Dead Aid. Here's a fact that might shock you. Africa's share of global trade is less than 3%. Yet trade, not aid, is what lifted countries like China and India out of poverty. In Chapter 6 of Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo makes the case that Africa's future depends not on handouts, but on competing in the global marketplace. In Chapter 5, Moyo showed us that Africa has real alternatives to aid, trade, investment, and global markets. Now, in Chapter 6, she zooms in on the most powerful of these, trade. She argues that if Africa can unlock its trade potential, the continent could create wealth far beyond anything aid has ever achieved. This chapter is called The Case for Trade, and it starts with a simple truth. Countries don't grow rich through aid, they grow rich through trade. Learning from Asia, Moyo points to examples like China, India, and other Asian nations. These countries were once poor, but they transformed their economies by exporting goods, opening markets, and integrating into the global economy. None of them relied on aid to achieve this. Instead, they leveraged trade to lift millions out of poverty. Africa's missed opportunity. Despite being rich in resources, oil, gas, minerals, and agriculture, Africa contributes only a tiny fraction to world trade. Why? Because the global trade system is stacked against it. Rich countries heavily subsidize their own farmers, making African crops uncompetitive. For example, American and European subsidies on cotton and sugar undercut African farmers, even when Africa produces these goods more cheaply. The power of fair trade. Moyo argues that if these unfair barriers were removed, Africa could unleash enormous potential. For instance, West African cotton farmers could compete globally without subsidies if given fair market access. Instead of endless aid transfers, allowing Africa to trade fairly would provide sustainable income and jobs. Botswana's success story. She gives the example of Botswana, which harnessed its diamond trade responsibly and grew from one of the poorest countries in the 1960s to a middle-income success story. Botswana didn't rely on aid as its foundation. It used trade, strong institutions, and good governance to thrive. The role of intra-African trade. Moyo also highlights Africa's weak internal trade. Many African countries trade more with Europe and Asia than with each other. By strengthening regional trade blocs and reducing barriers between African nations, the continent could grow stronger together. Her message is clear. Aid might provide temporary relief, but only trade builds long-term prosperity. Chapter 6 proves that Africa doesn't need sympathy. It needs fair access to markets. With trade, Africa can generate sustainable wealth, jobs, and independence. Without it, aid will keep Africans trapped in dependency. In Chapter 7, Moyo shifts the focus to foreign investment, showing how capital from outside, when managed wisely, can spark real transformation in Africa. The Chinese are our friends. What if Africa's future partner isn't the West with its aid checks, but China with its bulldozers, railways, and factories? In Chapter 7 of Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo argues that foreign investment, not aid, is what can truly transform Africa. In Chapter 6, we explored how trade, not aid, can create real prosperity for Africa. Now in Chapter 7, Moyo dives into another powerful alternative, foreign direct investment, or FDI, and she pays special attention to China's growing role in Africa. This chapter is called The Chinese Are Our Friends, and it challenges a lot of assumptions. Investment versus aid. Unlike aid, which often comes as free money with strings attached, foreign investment is about business. Investors put money into projects expecting returns. This creates accountability, jobs, and infrastructure, things aid often fails to deliver. China's new role. Moyo highlights China as a game changer. In the past 2 decades, China has poured billions into Africa, building roads, railways, power plants, and factories. From Angola's oil fields to Zambia's copper mines, China is investing not just money, but technology and know-how. Unlike Western donors, China's approach is business-focused. They want resources, and in return, they build infrastructure. The benefits. This partnership gives Africa what it desperately needs: infrastructure and jobs. A new railway in Ethiopia, highways in Kenya, and telecom networks across the continent are concrete examples of how investment builds the backbone of growth. These projects stimulate trade, improve logistics, and open up opportunities for local businesses. The controversy. Of course, not everyone sees China's involvement positively. Critics argue that China is creating a new form of dependency, a neo-colonial relationship where Africa trades resources for infrastructure but risks losing control. Moyo acknowledges these concerns, but insists that compared to aid, investment at least produces tangible growth and forces governments to negotiate better deals. Why FDI matters. Foreign direct investment encourages governments to create stable policies that attract more investors. Unlike aid, investors won't tolerate corruption and inefficiency for long. They'll move their money elsewhere. This creates pressure for better governance and stronger institutions. In short, Moyo argues that foreign investment, especially from emerging economies like China, is one of the most realistic and effective paths to Africa's development. Chapter 7 shows us that Africa doesn't need endless charity. It needs partnerships. Investment brings jobs, infrastructure, and accountability. Aid, on the other hand, brings dependency. Closing Chapter 8, Moyo takes us to the global financial markets, showing how Africa can borrow money just like any other region, without relying on aid handouts. If you believe Africa deserves investment over charity, then hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Afri Facts so you don't miss the next chapter of Dead Aid. Did you know that African governments can raise billions, not from aid, not from donors, but directly from Wall Street and global investors? In Chapter 8 of Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo shows how global capital markets could replace aid as a smarter, more sustainable source of money for Africa. In Chapter 7, we saw how foreign investment, especially from China, is reshaping Africa's future. Now, in Chapter 8, Moyo explains how Africa can tap into the global financial markets just like any other region of the world. She calls this chapter Let's Go Shopping because it's all about raising money the way strong economies do, by borrowing responsibly. Chapter 8. This chapter is fascinating because it flips the narrative. Instead of Africa being seen as a helpless aid recipient, Moyo argues it can stand on its own feet by using the same financial tools other nations rely on. Why capital markets matter. Global capital markets are where countries issue bonds, basically IOUs, that investors buy, expecting repayment with interest. When a country borrows this way, it has to be disciplined. Investors demand transparency, economic stability, and accountability. Unlike donors, investors don't hand out money for free. This pressure forces governments to be more responsible. Africa's first steps. Moyo highlights real examples. In 2007, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country outside South Africa to issue a Eurobond, raising $750 million. The money went into infrastructure, energy, and budget support. Other countries like Gabon, Nigeria, and Kenya soon followed, showing that investors were willing to put money into Africa when they saw opportunity. The benefits over aid borrowing from markets does three important things. 1. It builds discipline. Governments must deliver growth to repay investors. 2. It avoids dependency. Money comes from investment decisions, not charity. 3. It opens Africa to the world. Participation in global markets helps integrate African economies with international finance, trade, and business. The risks? Of course, there are dangers. Borrowing too much can lead to debt crises, something Africa has already experienced in the 1980s. But Moyo's point is that the problem is not borrowing itself, it's irresponsible borrowing. With proper financial management, capital markets can fund long-term development without creating aid dependency. A mindset shift. Perhaps the biggest message in this chapter is psychological. Tapping into global markets changes how Africa is perceived. Instead of being the continent of endless charity, Africa becomes a serious player in global finance, judged by the same standards as other regions. Chapter 8 teaches us that Africa doesn't need to beg, it can borrow. Global investors are willing to finance Africa's future if governments show stability and discipline. This is a healthier, more empowering alternative to endless aid. In Chapter 9, Moyo explores yet another alternative, microfinance and remittances, showing how small-scale finance in Africa's diaspora can fuel growth from the ground up. If you believe Africa should shop in global markets instead of begging for aid, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Afri Facts for the next breakdown of debt aid. Imagine a woman in rural Kenya who takes out a $50 loan to start selling vegetables, and within a year, she's feeding her family, sending her kids to school, and hiring a neighbor. Now imagine millions of stories like hers across Africa. In Chapter 9 of Debt Aid, Dambisa Moyo shows how small money, microfinance, and remittances can make a big difference in Africa's future. Welcome back to Afri Facts. In Chapter 8, we explored how Africa can borrow billions from global markets. But in Chapter 9, Moyo brings the story closer to home, to ordinary Africans and the role of small-scale finance. She argues that while aid creates dependency, tools like microfinance and remittances empower people and communities to drive development from the bottom up. This chapter, Making Development Happen, focuses on two powerful, people-centered alternatives to aid. 1. Microfinance. Small loans, big impact. Microfinance is about giving small loans, sometimes as little as $10 or $50, to poor individuals who would never qualify for a traditional bank loan. These loans often go to women, who are more likely to invest the money in businesses, food, and education for their children. Moyo explains that microfinance works because it taps into entrepreneurial spirit. Africans don't need handouts. They need access to credit to grow small businesses, street vendors, tailors, farmers, shopkeepers. These small businesses, multiplied across millions of households, create jobs, income, and dignity. She points to success stories from places like Bangladesh, the Grameen Bank model, but also emphasizes how microfinance is expanding across Africa. While not a silver bullet, it's a tool that builds independence instead of dependency. Africa's hidden treasure. Moyo highlights another massive source of finance, remittances from the African diaspora. Every year, Africans living abroad send billions of dollars back home to their families. In many countries, remittances exceed the value of aid. The difference? Remittances go directly to households to pay for school fees, medical bills, and small investments, without passing through corrupt governments or donor bureaucracies. This money is far more likely to have an immediate, positive impact on people's lives. Why these matter? Both microfinance and remittances empower Africans to take charge of their own development. Unlike aid, which often fuels corruption and dependency, these financial flows are bottom-up. They strengthen families, communities, and local economies. Moyo sees them as proof that Africa doesn't need to wait for outside saviors. Development can and does happen from within. Chapter 9 shows us that Africa's future isn't only in big infrastructure projects or billion-dollar loans. It's also in the small shops, farms, and families who, with just a little support, can transform their communities. The real power of development lies in Africans investing in themselves. In Chapter 10, the final chapter, Moyo brings everything together and makes her boldest argument yet: why aid must end and how Africa can finally break free. Chapter 10, A World Without Aid. What if Africa could finally break free from the chains of dependency? What if aid ended tomorrow, not as a tragedy, but as the beginning of a new era? In the final chapter of Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo makes her boldest case. Africa does not need aid to survive. It needs freedom to thrive. Welcome back to Afri Facts. We've journeyed through 9 chapters of Dambisa Moyo's eye-opening book, Dead Aid. We've seen how aid fails, how it cripples growth, and how Africa has better alternatives: trade, investment, capital markets, microfinance, and remittances. Now in Chapter 10, titled A World Without Aid, Moyo brings it all together with a powerful call. Africa must end its reliance on aid within the next decade. Moyo's vision is both radical and liberating. She argues that aid should not be Africa's permanent lifeline. Instead, it should be phased out, carefully, deliberately, but decisively. The case against endless aid. She reminds us that after 60 years and over $1 trillion, aid has failed to deliver lasting growth. It has fueled corruption, killed accountability, distorted economies, and left African nations dependent on outsiders instead of themselves. The roadmap forward, Moyo lays out a roadmap. Phase out aid gradually over 5 to 10 years. Replace it with trade agreements, foreign investment, and access to global capital markets. Strengthen domestic resources, from natural wealth to taxation to diaspora remittances. Encourage policies that support entrepreneurship, innovation, and local industries. A new African mindset. But beyond economics, Moyo emphasizes something deeper: mindset. She argues that Africa must see itself not as a victim waiting for charity, but as a continent capable of creating wealth and opportunity. Ending aid is not about cutting Africa off. It's about forcing governments to be accountable and citizens to take ownership of their future. A global shift. She also calls on the West to rethink its role. Instead of sending endless aid, rich nations should open markets, remove subsidies, and invest in Africa as equal partners. The future lies not in dependency, but in partnership. The final chapter of Dead Aid is both a warning and a promise. If Africa continues on the aid path, it risks another 50 years of dependency. But if it dares to let go and embrace trade, investment, and self-reliance, the continent has the potential to rise, just as Asia did. So here's the question Moyo leaves us with, and the question we leave you with today. Do we want Africa to remain dependent on aid, or do we believe in an Africa that stands on its own feet? At Afri Facts, we believe in the second option. We believe in an Africa of innovation, growth, and independence. If you've followed this journey through Dead Aid, thank you. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Afri Facts, and share this series with others who care about Africa's future. Because the story of aid may be ending, but Africa's story is just beginning.